So we thought it would be good to start with just a little bit of a summary of this book, kind of where we are currently, so that we can kind of situate our discussion. So I know that you were assigned to read a couple of chapters out of this book, Divided by Faith, but I don't at all assume that you would have had time to read it. So I'm just going to give a brief summary on that. Yeah, and as Susan said, I mean, one way to describe the contents of the book is how a well-intentioned people and their values and their institutions really do the opposite of what they say they're trying to do. So we're trying to figure out why that is, and also establish what that is. So let me start out just almost embarrassingly simplistic, but I think it helps situate what I'm about to say. So, you know, the devil, I say, gets up every morning, brushes the teeth, and then gets to the work of the devil, which is to divide, to disorient, distort, and ultimately destroy us. So the devil's consistent majoring in the D's. And then, of course, God is doing something very different, is working to unite us, to repair all that is broken, to reconcile, and to redeem. So where we see division, we can be pretty sure that's probably the devil at work. And when we see unity, we can be pretty sure that's God at work. So I'm going to use this concept, which the book itself is built around, is that the US and a few other societies, South Africa, for example, are racialized societies. Let me tell you what I mean. So it means that race matters profoundly for the differences in our life experience, for our opportunities, for our social relationships, who will marry, who will know, where we'll live, where we'll go to church, all those kind of things. And ultimately, a racialized society always has one thing in common. It gives whatever society values, it gives it out unequally across racial groups. There's variation within racial groups, but a racialized society means you can always rank these groups, these artificially created racial groups, from top to bottom in terms of who has most of society's rewards. So really, a racialized society is division and injustice. So if we go back to what we just looked at, a racialized society is probably the work of the devil and not the work of God. In 2020, what are some advantages? So in the racialized society that the US has, and we'll go into this more later, but those who are labeled white as a group, historically and currently, have the most advantages. So what are they in 2020? These are some of them. I can't get them all on here, but whites have better health on average. And I'm not going to go into all these, but I'll put them up so you can take a look. Things like we find repeatedly auto loan rates, mortgage rates, whites pay lower rates. Partly that's because they make more, but that's another advantage that they have. Why should they make more? They do. Some more here. And then even down to environmental pollution, hazardous waste. Whites on average breathe cleaner air, drink cleaner water, have lower exposure to overall pollution, and therefore less cancer rates from such things. So my point here is not just that, you know, that you have one of these advantages or that somehow having these advantages makes life easy. I think that's what's difficult when if you're white and you're told you have advantages, you know you struggle and life is not easy. But what it means is when you combine all of these, if you still think life's a struggle, which it is, it means it's even harder, more difficult for others because they have to live life without this combination of all of these advantages. Let me illustrate. I think this was a really brilliant study done by a professor in Milwaukee. Now you'll notice the dates. So the students I have today were not born even in 1993. So they think I'm talking about ancient history. So I will update this. But the study was brilliant. It asked a very basic question, which was, if you just took whites and blacks, and in this period in Milwaukee, that's pretty much folks that lived there, a very tiny percentage of others. If they had bought a home in 1971 worth $40,000, he asked, what was it worth 22 years later? And this was painstaking work because you had to go through housing values, sales, and everything for every house in the Milwaukee region. But this is what he found. So if you were a white who owned a home over that period, you made about, well, over $200,000 in appreciation on your home, just like we would expect it would work. You were African American, though you did the same thing, you bought a home, you actually lost money. Your house was worth less over that period. So although the Black folks in Milwaukee were doing the same thing, whites were getting wealthy from it and Blacks were actually losing wealth from it. I want to give you my personal example because we experienced this. In the Houston region where we lived in 2010, I could look up, that was our last census. Our neighborhood was 80% African American, 16% Latino, and 4% other. But it doesn't look like, maybe you might have an image of what such a neighborhood would look like in your head, but this is actually the neighborhood. It's a subdivision in the newer part of Houston. And that's actually our house there on the, I don't know if that's your left or right, but there it is. Okay, so let me give you some details. We built that house in 2006. So it was a fairly new neighborhood and we had a house built, $273,000 it cost us. In 2012, my family and I moved to Denmark, Copenhagen, Denmark. So we put our house up for sale because we were going to be living there for some time. We could not sell it for what we bought it for, but we got an offer for $225,000. So we would lose some money, but that's what it was. If you're familiar with buying and selling houses, you know that isn't the end of it. You have to have the house appraised. And the appraiser, who actually never came to our home, said your home is worth $160,000, no more. And as you know, they use comps, they call them, comparatives from other areas or the local area. So banks aren't going to loan more than 160,000. So we for more than that. So we had to sell it for what we were told it's worth. And then that meant we lost 113,000. So we're in a primarily African-American neighborhood, overwhelming 96% minority neighborhood. And it doesn't matter if I'm white. It doesn't matter that I have a PhD. It doesn't matter if I write books. My individual achievements cannot overcome what is a structural issue. And that is housing values are determined not by your own care, but by what's happening around you, what's happening in your neighborhood. So that's the lesson. I wondered if it was just an individual experience that we might have had during that period, or if that was happening all across the Houston area. So I asked a couple of our, well, really my top 2 grad students at the time, both of whom are now professors, to reproduce that Milwaukee study, but update it and do it for the Houston region. And they even got fancier because they were well-trained in statistics. So they could make the neighborhoods statistically identical in terms of some of these things you see, like school quality, poverty rates, all that. So what differed was the racial. And then it's that same question again. If you bought a home in 2005, sold it 10 years later, what happened? In the white neighborhoods of the Houston region at that time, you made $82,000. In Hispanic neighborhoods, you lost $4,400. And in Black neighborhoods, on average, they lost $26,500. Now, those two folks have, in a sense, built their career on studying this entire process. So they had an important paper come out just a couple months ago. They were able to obtain this data for all metropolitan areas in the United States from 1980 until 2020. So what they found is that this effect you see right here and that we saw in Milwaukee happens in every single metropolitan area that is diverse. And the gap that existed in 1980 is growing larger and larger over time. So it's not shrinking, it's getting bigger and bigger. This is a kind of an extended example of what I mean by a racialized society. This is just one aspect of what would be white advantage. And this translates into wealth. Most middle-class folks at least build their wealth through home appreciation or apartment appreciation, or whatever you might own. So here's a look at Black wealth and white wealth. This is a study by the University of Michigan. And they've been tracking the same Black and white families since 1984. And they haven't since 2007. So that's why it stops right there. We'll update in a bit, but tracking wealth. So you can see for Black families, on average, their wealth really hasn't changed much over that period. It's always been under 10,000, ranging between like 3 and 5,000, something like that. Here's what happened for the white families in the study at the same time. These are several thousand families randomly sampled across the country. And why is that? Again, most of that was housing appreciation. That's why I went through to show you how that was happening and still is happening. So that has real impacts, of course, for what you can do with your life when you have money. Updated for all 4 groups. As of now, you can see average white is worth about 200,000. Asians are a little less than half of that, and Hispanic and Black substantially less than that. Well, we always say the answer is education, and I am an educator by profession, so obviously I believe in education. But what is the return? There's a couple of things from this graph to take away. One is the more education you get, the more money on average you will make. That's not a surprise. That's what we hope. But you can see at every level, there's always white advantage compared to every other group. For some reason, the other groups, though they can make more as they get more education, don't make as much as white folks for the same level of education. So Asian households come close to the average income of white households. And they do that by having more education on average than white households. But you know, there's an upper limit of how much education you can get, obviously. And that would be the professional degree or the grad degree. So let's summarize all the complexity of race into one graph. So typically in the US, before we had much immigration from anywhere other than Europe and Africa, obviously forced immigration, you could take society's rewards and rank the groups. And it's been this way since day one. Whites get more, Blacks get less, Native Americans in a sense don't even make it onto the graph because they've been put away and isolated. As we've changed our immigration laws, especially since the 1960s, there's actually a second plane by which to understand race. And this is where we see Asian and Hispanic. So Asians have more of society's rewards in terms of economics, education, et cetera, than Hispanics and Blacks. But they're in this odd category that Hispanics are too, which is this perpetual foreignness. Whether they're recent immigrants or been here 3, 4 generations, it's somehow you're not American as perceived by others. Well, the church, of course, is racialized too. You're one of the rarities, your church, because we just published a paper looking at all congregations in the United States. 84% are what we define as racially homogenous. It means at least 80% of all the people in that congregation are the same race. So that you are not, then you're in that 16% that is not. A lot of times people say, well, churches just reflect their neighborhoods. So we studied that, where we could actually get data on the neighborhoods. And we had already the data on the churches. And what we found, you see this 10x, that although neighborhoods are highly segregated, churches are actually 10 times more segregated than the neighborhoods that they're sitting in. So I always say, even if churches could reflect their neighborhoods, we would have an explosion of diversity within our congregations. Well, we've been conducting studies here for a while now, so are now able to do some comparisons over a 20-year period. So Divided by Faith is a book written that comes out in about 2000, based on 99, 2000 data. And we decided we needed working on a new book on that update now. But let me give you some comparisons here. So we had asked a series of questions in these surveys and in these interviews. It was both surveys and interviews. Do you think our country has a race problem? So I can summarize what white evangelicals, conservative Christians, it really came down to their answer of what, if they said there was a race problem, and many said there isn't, but if there was, no matter how big or small, it also down not to it being a social issue, but really it was personal defects of some individuals and some groups as they attempted to relate to each other. So it wasn't laws or policies or court rulings, but it's people holding negative attitudes, people not getting along, and people not trying hard enough. So these views were held by many, many whites. And the other one was often a race problem is people like, say, Jesse Jackson or others who make money by saying there's a race problem. So that's what it means by blaming self-interested minorities. They would see it as being carried on because there are certain people that they can make money if we believe there's a race problem. Now contrast that when we interviewed most evangelicals of color, we much more heard this kind of thing. It's unequal access to education and to neighborhoods and resources. We have a race problem because there's systematic discrimination. That's in our laws, it's our policies, it's our criminal justice system, and so on. And what we might call white dominance or white advantage, some of those things that we had looked at already here. So the question is, why such a difference? And in the book, we talk about what we call the theologically rooted cultural tools of white evangelicals. And there's just three. I'll just briefly summarize what they are. The first one has a fancy, sounds fancy, but it's not that fancy really, accountable free will individualism. So the most fundamental thing of all in the white cultural toolkit is individualism. That what is fundamental, the fundamental reality of everything are the individuals. You might say, if you think of a chair is built of its components. So if we took this perspective of individualism, we would say the chair isn't the fundamental reality, each of its components is. And so that's what we need to understand. Free will is that as individuals, we get to choose, and that comes out of our fundamental choice for Christ or not. And of course, accountable. We can make choices, but those choices, we will be held accountable ultimately for the ones we make. So there can be good choices and bad, right and wrong. The second important one is relationalism. So our fundamental understanding of the Christian faith and coming to faith is that we establish this relationship with Christ. So we have this vertical relationship. And that's what we argue gets transposed into understanding social life, that's not only fundamental, but all of social life is relationships. So like, how would you make change with that understanding? You would say one heart at a time, one relationship at a time. And importantly, what we call anti-structuralism. So this is more than just not believing there are structures or systems like a criminal justice system. Most white evangelicals we talked to saw that as a facade and kind of an excuse for people to say there's problems when really they should themselves fix things. But it's not just that you don't believe in them, it's that you, in this term anti, you actually have to oppose them. Okay, so you would, in terms of like the way you would vote against anybody advocating that structures matter. All right, in 2019, do you think our country has a race problem? So we started this next study in 2019. White evangelicals, 29% said our country definitely has a race problem. Compared to other whites, notice the difference there. If they're not a white evangelical, other whites, almost half think there's a race problem. We compare to Black evangelicals, 79%, compared to other Blacks, 73%. So there's a 50 percentage point gap between Black and white evangelicals, only about a quarter of that between other white and Black Americans. In other words, and this is why the book is called Divided by Faith, because we kept finding over and over again that although white and Black, and white and other Christians are divided, white Christians, and particularly white evangelical Christians, compared to other evangelical Christians, are the most divided. It wasn't just like we found this once or twice. It was basically on everything that we studied, not just even race, but on multiple things. Here I'm going to look at practicing white Christians. So not just evangelicals, but anybody. You could be Catholic, you could be mainline. These are if you say your faith is important, you say you're a Christian, and you attend church at least monthly. So in 2019, 40% of practicing white Christians said we have a race problem compared to 75% of Black practicing Christians. But as you know, 2020 was quite a tumultuous year and a painful year in many ways. There was multiple upheavals and protests all through the summer. So we thought certainly things will have changed. So we did a follow-up survey at the end of the summer in 2020. And what we found was a bit surprising. With all the stuff we could see on TV nightly, see in their social media, actually less practicing white Christians now said that there's a race problem, and more practicing Black Christians did. So in 2019, 35 percentage point gap between Black and white practicing Christians. They'd grown to 48 percentage points just a year later. Now, even for the folks who say there is a race problem, they don't agree on what it is. And this goes back to the cultural tools. So we had asked a question, do you think that the problem is systemic discrimination, or do you think it's individual prejudice? Probably shouldn't surprise you at this point that for African-American Christians, 2/3 said it's systemic discrimination. And for white evangelicals, 3/4 said it's individual prejudice. So there's fundamental disagreement on what the problem is, even if we can agree there's a problem. We also asked this question. The US has been oppressive to minorities. Do you agree or disagree? So 75% of Black Christians agreed with that. And that's more than other Black Americans. Again, that's why I call it divided by faith, because what we see is that when you add the component of Christian faith, at least, it actually, again, it pushes the groups further apart, even from within their own racial group. 60% of Asian Hispanic practicing Christians agree, compared to 50% of their fellow groups. But for white evangelicals, just 28% think that the US has ever been oppressive to minorities. And you can see it's not only different from fellow Christians, but quite a bit different from other white Americans. We asked, how do you explain racial inequality? Now, we did this in 1999, and I'll update it here in just a moment. But the question goes something like this, and this comes from a survey we didn't do, so we had to use what they asked. It's a national survey, and it says, Blacks on average make less money, have homes worth less, and something else, I forget. But then white Americans, why do you think this is? Given some 4 different possibilities of what they can answer. So one is that Black folks, they lack motivation to have good jobs and good housing. So for Americans in general, the white-Black gap in their answers, whites are 9 percentage points more likely than Blacks to say that's the reason. It's that Blacks lack motivation. But if we look just at conservative Protestants or evangelicals, then that more than triples that gap, where white evangelicals are far more likely than Black evangelicals, Black Christians, to say it's lack of motivation. And then the very reverse when it's lack of access to good education or it's discrimination. So what did we find 20 years later? We found that these gaps are similar, and when they weren't, they were actually larger than they had been back in 1999. I have here, but don't ask. So when we did interviews around the country, we were in people's homes, we were in restaurants before COVID, right? Obviously. I describe it in the book as this. It says that the book found that for most white evangelicals, the race problem, no matter, I'm reading you the wrong quote. Okay, from the book. What we have not mentioned is the irritation, this question, why racial inequality, raised for a number of white conservative Protestants. Our respondents appeared to be friendly, open, committed, caring people. They were a joy to be with. But many, no most, did not like it when we asked this question about racial inequality. Either they did not agree with the premise of the question, about 15% said, we have our facts wrong, there is no inequality, or they were irritated by Blacks themselves, or the seemingly implicit suggestion that whites somehow might be at fault. People often went to what we would call the lazy butt account, expressed in anger or at best irritated tones, especially directed towards Black Christians who should know better and should work harder. Well, 20 years later, we followed up. And so we're interested in not just what people think, but what do they feel? So we asked them, when you see the word white privilege, how does that make you feel? And we gave them some options, and then they could also write in what they wanted to say. So for white Christians, the most common answer was, I feel judged. This was rarely said by Christians of color. They more often would say things like, it makes me sad, it's a reality, it shouldn't be, things like that. But let me read you some of the comments white Christians wrote in. I feel annoyed. This is a joke. Bull bleep. It doesn't exist. There are no white privileges. Such a stupid phrase and question. This is inaccurate. It is made up. I feel labeled. It's a made up phrase to make white people feel guilty. It's a myth. I feel anger at the implication and the suggestion that it exists. I am not a racist. This term is false. Stop this nonsense. It is ridiculous. Give it a rest. All groups have privileges. Now, I'll do one more here. We asked them, how do you feel when you see the phrase Black power? So the number one answer for African Americans was proud. Hopeful was second. For whites, number one answer was angry. And some of the things they wrote in, this is wrong. Why don't we have white power? It sounds like prejudice. Using color words is bad. Black power should not exist. Such terms are what keep racism alive. This is racism. I feel scared. This is not what MLK would have wanted. Blacks are retarded if they try to act superior. This resounds with prejudice. This is nonsense. You cannot be serious. I feel concerned. Black power? Yeah, right. None of them can get their act together. It's all about blaming white. They throw away the opportunities we give them. I feel annoyed. I feel agitated. All right, so we also asked, what do they see as the solution to the race problem? And for white conservative Protestants, white evangelicals, two answers dominated. One is what we call the miracle motif, and that is if you become a Christian, if you receive Christ, then problems are solved. So racism will go away and racial division will end. So it would be, you know, like you hope, like if you become a Christian, you'll be able to get off drugs or whatever else issues you might face. So that's what we mean by the motif, and we heard that quite often. And the other is that you need to make a friend across race. And that follows, of course, from the cultural tools of individualism and relationalism are what matter, and you need to resist structures. Then the way to make change is to make a friend. Now we liken it in the book that if you have the wrong tools, you solve problems that you see, but you can solve them incorrectly. And so that though you're trying very hard, you don't actually get anywhere. An example we use in the book is if you were had a basement that kept leaking, and your answer was always get buckets and let's get this water scooped up in the buckets and throw it out, you're trying to address the problem, but you never solve the problem, right? It's a structural problem. You got to repair the cement blocks, obviously, that are leaking. There's some structural issue there. But if you can't see that, you'll work very hard trying to address it. And that's what this picture is illustrating. Okay, now we're going to go into discussion, but let me just suggest 3 positive things here. If division is of the devil and it's in the church, then we want to get it out. We want to get it out by boosting actual Christ community. Just like if I want to, when I first moved to where I live now, I had too many weeds and stuff in my grass. So I could have gone through and pulled out all the weeds. But I thought instead, let me really nurture the grass that I have. And as the grass grows and thickens, it will just choke away the weeds, which is what happened. That's what I mean by boosting Christ's community. I just want to give you 3 ways to do that. So the hope in that, of course, what we're doing together as Christians is that we can listen and learn from each other to help each other. That's why the body metaphor is so fundamental to what we read in the New Testament. We actually really do need each other. And we need to work for biblical justice and unity, compassion, as we were talking about at the very beginning. And to do that, we have to do 3 things, which I will go into each of these with just one slide. Listen, learn, and act. And in a society like ours, that actually takes a lot of courage, because it often means going against the grain of what comes naturally. So these bucket of boosters for Christ's community is, first of all, to listen. And I put in here trust. So instead of a posture of mistrust, and this is what we find over and over, is even fellow Christians, when they're different racial groups, their fundamental starting point is over and over again is mistrust of what other groups are saying to them. It can't be true. So it's resistance, it's defensiveness. What if we, even just for a week, said we're all going to assume that as Christians, we're going to share truth with each other. And I'm going to, instead of being resistant to that, I'm going to just seek to know more, even if I don't understand it or if it doesn't fit the way I see the world. If we could do that, that would be an amazing key to unlock what's going on in our culture. Second is to learn and to connect. There's many things you can do, but I'm going to recommend one called bethebridge.com. I love it because it's free, because it's thousands of people that go through this. My wife is going through this program right now. It's awesome because it comes with videos and podcasts and all of that. Again, all free. And it is for Christians to help educate and empower us to move forward in racial reconciliation. Okay, and then finally is to act. There are many ways that we can act to counteract what we have in our society, our racialized society. You're already doing one of those, worshiping together. That's an important, vital step. Another is to live in a racially diverse neighborhood. All of these things are to help diversify friendships, which matter. You can, and I would recommend joining an organization that works for biblical justice, reconciliation. No need to recreate the wheel. There are organizations already out there, so it's just join and contribute what you can. And then I would say to undo white advantage by being holistically pro-life. So I am pro-life. I am strongly pro-life. I have had to learn over time that I want to be more than pro-life from womb to birth. I want to be pro-life from womb to tomb, across the whole lifespan. And when I start thinking in that way, then I have to care about, like, is there inequality in access to housing? Is there injustice in the criminal justice system? Because all of that is about me trying to be pro-life consistently. So ultimately, that's a rediscipling of often the way that we are taught in our culture. So I'll conclude here. We know Christ is over all. We know, as Martin Luther King said, we are woven together in this single garment of destiny. When Christ says that we are one body and that hand and feet and the brain and all parts need each other, we have to take that seriously. And we have to look at any time that we've separated those, and we've got to figure out how to bring them back together. So I will stop sharing there and we'll move to questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was just really powerful, and I'm sure we all learned a lot. And I'm going to ask Jeff to share some follow-up questions, and then I'm going to invite everyone who's here tonight. If you'd like to submit a question for our time of Q&A with Michael, please just send them directly to me in the chat box. You can just select my name. Me, along with our co-hosts, we're the only people I think you can select in the chat box. So please send those to me, and we'll get to as many as you can. But before we get to Jeff, Michael, just you acknowledge that in your interview process, people had all sorts of emotions. And I'm sure even tonight, with those here, hearing your research, are feeling all sorts of things, whether it's just sadness and heartache or anger, hearing your findings, or maybe because of maybe the oppression that they're hearing and the division that they're seeing, or feeling some of what you described, feeling potentially attacked or that they're being made to feel guilty. In your experience, have you, how would you counsel someone, or how have you counseled people when they express those feelings?
It's a great question. So when we talk about race, it so automatically becomes personalized. So it becomes a kind of a game of, you're a racist, no, I'm not, blame, trying to label people, all of that. That can't be what we're about. It doesn't matter where you're at. It matters where you're going. And it matters that we do it together. So if you feel individually something, I would say, especially if you're white, right? Because if you're white, you most often feel like you're always attacked and you're like, what do I just get up and go to work. Why am I at fault? Is to think about not you individually, to get out of that individualism, but to think about, okay, if it's true, there really are all these advantages that whites somehow get, even though I don't know that I don't know how I'm getting them, then, and we really do have a racial hierarchy, then that can't be of Christ. So how can we work to undo that? It doesn't have to do anything with you personally. I know that sounds weird to say that, but we're so focused on trying to think right individually that I think it sucks away actually solving some of the issues that we're facing. I always say this, well, we as Christians are changing one heart at a time. The devil is changing entire societies at a time, using television, media, whatever. I think the devil for a second believes in one heart at a time. That'd be too slow.
Thank you. Jeff, I want to kick it over to you to ask a few follow-up questions.
Great. And thanks, Michael. Your book has been obviously a really important book in the Christian world for a long time. Pretty much every book been written on race relations since your book was written, quotes your book at various places. And so I really want to commend it to our congregation. It strikes me that one of the goals for the Christian community is to be of one heart and mind. That's what we're told the early church manifested, and your research shows that we aren't even close. And I'm going to read you a quote from the end of your book that speaks to this, and I just ask you to comment a little bit on it. You say, you're quoting someone else here, but you say, the evangelical Protestant mind has never relished complexity. Indeed, its crusading genius, whether in religion or politics, has always tended toward oversimplification of issues and the substitution of inspiration and zeal for critical analysis and serious reflection. And you go on to say, with few exceptions, evangelicals lack serious thinking on this issue. Rather than integrate their faith with knowledge of race relations, inequality, and American society, they generally allow their cultural constructions to shape one-dimensional assessments and solutions to multi-dimensional problems. This will not do. And earlier you simply say solutions that call only for structural change are probably as naive as solutions that merely ask individuals to make some friends across race. We're trying to get to be one heart and mind. To me, that seems to get at some of that. We have simple solutions on either the left or the right, or orthodox views or heterodox views, rather than complex, really analysis, asking, not only why did this come to be, why is it, and then how do we address it as well. Usually complex problems have complex solutions. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I appreciate you reading that. It is part of the, so cultures in the US have long-standing traditions, and evangelicalism certainly does. And I, just so you know, I'm part of that. I am an evangelical. I'm obviously white, but I attend a church like yours, a multiracial church. But we come from a history, and that history is, you know, through tent revivals and appealing to emotion and getting people to make a conversion. And all of that adds up to what historically then has been, we have a go-to set of solutions to anything. And those go-to set of solutions are what I call the cultural tools. It's our understanding right away. So rather than analyze a problem, because part of what evangelicalism has been defined at in our country is also zeal and action. Instead of analyzing an issue to try to actually understand it, to solve it, to address it, we just immediately jump into action. And we immediately jump into action because we believe we already know what the problem is, because our cultural tools are so strong, we can't imagine it would be anything else. It's got to be bad relationships. It's got to be some people not working hard enough. It's got to be whatever we might come to. So yeah, I think what I'm really appealing to there is, I don't know. I don't think Christ is there's mystery in Christ. Right? So I think there's mystery in God's creation. So I don't advocate spending all of our time trying to understand a problem. We have to act eventually, but we've got to spend some time trying to understand and come up with a multifaceted solution.
And so what has helped you sort of embrace the complexity? I mean, you know, on the one hand, your work is very descriptive, right? You do a lot of describing what's going on out there. You have some prescription involved in it, and really helpful prescription there at the end about listening and slowing down, which I think is really important. But what else would you encourage to help us again become one heart and mind in embracing both the complexity, but then really getting into action that brings us to, even if they're complex solutions, they're solutions all the same? What have you found helpful?
You know, it's been a lot of helpful is, you know, actually trying things and seeing when they work and don't work, talking to people and finding out they don't see it the same way. But when you're engaged in this kind of study, I get a privileged view in the sense that I get to see a whole range of how people are thinking across race, across region, age groups. Some of the follow-up books that I've written focused intensively on, you know, I say, if we have partly a structural issue, what is the fundamental structure for the Christian church? It's our local congregations. And so I actually followed up with 3 different books looking at what would happen if we could move from racially homogenous congregations to racially mixed churches. And, you know, we end up advocating, saying not only biblically, I had a theologian work on one of the books with me, that is the model of the first century church. We are to be going across whatever divisions our society gives. So it's a fundamental structural change. But I will say this, what we have found in the 20 years, we have seen a doubling of these kind of congregations, but they're not working. They're not the anecdote that they're supposed to be, and why. Now, this isn't just my study, but also a study by Corey Edwards, a professor at Ohio State. What she finds is that white power, white structure, white expectations dominate even in a mixed church. So that we're not going to talk about, for example, injustice that exists because it makes our white members uncomfortable. Well, that's the whole reason to have the congregations, not just to develop relationships. That is one. But if you're going to have authentic relationships, you got to talk about the things that are actually impacting us. That's the promise of these congregations. When we can actually understand what we're each experiencing and try to work together to help one another. If we're not willing to talk about it, if we're worried that that's going to cause conflict, and that's what we heard over and over again in congregations that are racially mixed, then we've lost the gospel power for what it could do. So a long-winded answer to your question is trial and error, trying something, putting something out there, watching how it unfolds, seeing how it has to be tweaked or changed.
Great, thank you.
Wow.
On the tools question, strikes me in those three tools that on the one hand, particularly the first two, probably really still resonate no matter whether you think more tools need to be added or not. It seems to be an anti-tool in some ways. In other words, yeah, we do believe people are people of agency, that they have free will, that they are responsible. We do believe relationships matter and that relationships change us. The third tool seems more of a tool that you would say that's a tool you got to get rid of because that's not helpful. But then there probably are other tools perhaps that you would think need to be added. And again, these tools, as you describe them, lead us to the positions that we have. What are the tools that maybe the additional tools? Sounds like we need to get rid of anti-structuralism altogether from your perspective. Although I may be putting words in your mouth, so don't let me do that. But what tools would you add?
Yeah, I did exactly what you said. I keep the first two because they're fundamental to our faith. They're not going anywhere, nor should they. But I would say that anti-structuralism needs to be set aside, needs to be put in the garbage even, because that one is really, that doesn't even, it's not biblical. I know that we can read the Bible that way, but we're reading it incorrectly. And if we read it together across racial groups, we'll find out we're reading it incorrectly. There's plenty of structure. There's plenty of God talking to entire communities, God assigning blame or reward to whole communities because of the actions of some. So maybe just the easiest thing is to throw away the anti, keep the structural, and admit that those things can matter too, and they matter across the gamut, and they matter in our faith. Another one that we actually wrote a book a few years ago looking at the 5 cultural tools or building blocks of African-American Christian faith. And one that you don't see in the white Christian faith is, how do you put it? Anticipation and expectation that God works in the here and now, that God cares directly about this world, so that the distance between heaven and earth is a lot smaller in the black cosmos than in white cosmos. And so that too then leads to kind of structural view. So if there's inequality, God really cares about that. God really wants to see his people thrive, not just in the next life, but here as well.
I'm going to ask one more question, Susan, if you'll allow me to do that, and then we'll open it up.
I'm getting so many amazing questions. So thank you.
So this is one that we had talked about preliminarily before we talked to Michael. So, Michael, you mentioned how certain phrases, Black power, white privilege, create reactions. I think there are more, obviously. Two that we've heard a lot this summer are anti-racism as a phrase, and also the phrase white supremacy. You've worked with Black and white congregations. These terms get thrown out there. A lot of times people use them, including systemic racism, without entirely defining what all these things mean. How can you help us a little bit navigate those waters, since that actually does tend, those terms get used and they shut down conversation very quickly, and people assume they know what they mean. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So let me start by saying, so there's a really prolific author who I love to read named Jamar Tisby, just had a new book come out, How to Fight Racism. I'd recommend it highly. It literally just came out a week or two ago. But I was listening to him on a podcast, and they were asking, things like, what is this? They were asking specifically, what is critical race theory? And he said, I had no idea what critical race theory was until I kept getting angry emails sent to me calling me a critical race theorist. So he said I had to look up and see what it was. And I can ascribe to some of it I don't. But Jamar Tisby is a historian, and one of the things he pointed out, he said, this is a fundamental tool to preserve racial hierarchy, is you come up with a label, and the label itself shuts down discussion. So the current label is, you're a critical race theorist. Before it was a Marxist, you're a communist, you're a socialist. We can still use all those terms. So once he says you take something like I'm working for racial justice, you link it to a term that is considered 100% bad, critical race theory, Marxism, whatever. And as soon as you can link that, you shut down that topic. So Christians can no longer address it. So one that just causes a firestorm, right, is white supremacy, because white supremacy, we have one image in our heads, at least white folks do, and that is the KKK and the sheets they're wearing and crosses burning. But white supremacy, this is the formal definition. So it's a social system, and it's usually buttressed through political support, in which white people are given dominance or preference or privilege over other groups. That's what it means. So statistically, we do live in a white supremacy society, if you just follow that definition. But the term is so inflammatory. I don't use the term myself. I talk about white advantage, something like that. So yeah, I would encourage people, when you hear these discussions, notice how they won't ever even define these terms. They're just used for the emotional effect. And is there a way that you can either question that or resist that? And I'll stop there.
Thanks. Susan, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who are sending me your very thoughtful questions. And I will share them with Michael, and we'll get to as many as we can before 9 o'clock. Although we could be here a lot longer, but thank you, Michael, again. The first question I want to ask, someone says, I really appreciate your advice on being holistically pro-life. How do we encourage white Christians to see how this applies to areas such as police brutality, criminal justice, access to affordable and quality healthcare, mental health support, non-discriminatory social welfare services?
Okay, so you can come up with different metaphors, like a single garment, the web of connection, a web of life. There have been different ones that different folks have used over time, but those have been influential to me. So, I was pro-life in the more narrow sense for a long time, until I started to hear those, like, okay, if you care about life, you have to care about it always, all the way through. So then it does lead you to ask, well, then what would that mean? Like, how would I actually be pro-life after birth, from age 1 to 2, from age 10 to 12? So I guess I would say, can you come up with a word image to share with someone if you're trying to talk with somebody about this importance? And then start thinking about, like, if it's the garment of life, what goes in that garment? What threads make up that garment? That's when you can start putting those things that you just read in there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And this is connected to this question of how do we talk to people. There's many questions coming in about how to talk about these issues. Someone notes on page 103, you say racial inequality challenges white evangelicals' world understanding, and it challenges their very faith in God in America. How as non-whites can we engage in conversations about race with white evangelicals in a way that doesn't potentially break down their worldview, or in a way that they might listen and be receptive to conversation?
Such a great question. I was leading a group in our church. I could go into a whole backstory, but I'll skip the backstory and just say, we have a group in our church called White Learners. And the whole purpose is to talk among ourselves about how to move forward in being advocates and having better understanding about race. And the single biggest concern by far, always, is going home at Thanksgiving and having to talk to their family. Because if you're anything like the white families in our church, going home to their white families for Thanksgiving means there's going to be off-color jokes. There's going to be things said about minorities not working hard enough, etc. So do I address it? Do I ignore it? All of that. So this is why I say one of the boosters is to ask people to just not be defensive, to let their guard down, and just, can you trust me for one conversation? the best illustration I saw of this was, there was it follows men of all different ethnicities in like this 3-day workshop. And the white folks in particular are so resistant to this discussion that there's racial inequality. And finally, is an Asian man who's the leader, so to speak. And he says to one of the white men, he said, what if what these men of color are saying about racial inequality were true? Just sit with that for a moment. What if it were true? We understand you're saying it's not, but what if it were? And it was that broke this man. I mean, at that point, he said, well, then that would be very sad. That would mean my whole understanding of the world isn't right. That would mean, and he actually broke down. Like, I think he was able to feel that could be real. So sometimes it's just a simple question like that. What if it were true? Or yeah, something like that. So you don't want to get people on the defensive, but you want to allow them the ability to imagine a different reality.
Thank you. This question, and I know Jeff got to talking about some solutions. This person notes, your presentation on what we can do to boost Christ's community sounds like white evangelical solutions. Individualism and relations. How do we avoid falling into these pitfalls as a group and as individuals? One of the suggestions was to diversify worship. How might a culturally white church accomplish this?
We studied that a lot, and I'll tell you how they do it and then why that doesn't work, why that's inappropriate. So I call these memes as the way to describe, but they're float around in our culture, understandings of things. So the archetype of worship in our culture, and there's a great book on this about worship in multiracial communities by Gerardo Marti. The archetype of worship is an African-American worship leader, because the meme is that African-Americans are more connected with God than others. They're more emotional. They're just more in tune with God. But that doesn't translate like to, you could be a preacher. You could be a senior pastor. The archetype of senior pastor, at least for white folks, still is white, usually white male. So then what happens, how does this play out? Over and over and over and over and over again, as churches are trying to diversify, as they're trying to incorporate different understandings, different racial understandings, they hire a person of color to lead worship. Okay, well, that's one step, but it doesn't go anywhere else. And usually a person of color leading worship doesn't have a lot of influence in the church beyond the music being played, etc. So instead, what you're looking for, and I will say in our church, let me just quickly describe, 40% Asian, 30% white, 20% black, 10% Hispanic. We face these issues all the time. Our senior pastor is Korean. We have a leadership team, that's the head, deacon board, or whatever you might call it. We have to have representation from all the groups. You might have heard at the beginning, I'm the leader of the leadership team, but I didn't want to be the leader of the leadership team. We asked all the persons of color, would you want to do it? They did not want to do it. So I said, okay, I will step in and do it until one of you are ready. So we think about in terms of actual leadership and influence in a congregation that has to represent multiple voices, and they have to have real voices. So that's the key. Power sharing is the short answer.
Thank you. Question, particularly in light of what happened in our capital just several weeks ago. What are your thoughts on Christian nationalism and how tied it seems to be with white evangelicalism?
Yep. So got a book sitting here on Christian nationalism. Just really important book that just came out. So that's something interesting that's particular to the US. I suppose you can find examples in a few other countries. But we have this merging of Christian faith and a politics, a particular politics, an understanding of what our nation is. We are chosen by God, of course, but it's essentially, it means we're usually anti-immigrant. It means that we see our country as very, very special and particularly blessed. So this book says that that's the fundamental understanding. And it finds, of course, that most white evangelicals are Christian nationalists, about 80%. And so they're going to vote in certain ways because they are ultimately Christian nationalists. Now, I'm working on a book right now that's arguing Christian nationalism is a component of something larger, which I call the religion of whiteness. And I know this will sound controversial, so I won't go into it too much. But I think it's an important component of people who ultimately believe in the racial hierarchy, because Christian nationalism, and this is from multiple studies since that book that I'm talking about came out, finds it applies to white folks, but when non-whites are Christian nationalists, they're not Christian nationalists in the same way. It doesn't shape how they vote. It doesn't shape how they understand immigration, things like that. I don't know, a little convoluted, but Christian nationalism, very important, and it's going to be more and more important as we go forward.
Yes, agreed. Thank you very much. This next question starts off with a thank you, as many of the questions people wanted to say thank you. Thank you, Michael, so much for your research and gospel-led presentation. What's the best way to engage folks like many in New York City who don't have to be convinced that structural racism exists, but struggle to find real answers through thoughtful conversations for fear of being canceled by extreme voices on the left?
Mm-hmm. I have a quote actually from the New York Times. I forget the gentleman who wrote it, but it's a white gentleman who says, the number one issue that causes us to not be able to move forward on issues of race and racial inequality is the cancel culture. That suggests that being called a racist, even the slightest hint or whiff of that term being applied to you, will shut you down as a human being and shut conversation down. End of story. This is where I get I feel sensitive for this, why I don't want to be busy trying to figure out where people individually stand, because we get into that kind of thing. Oh, you're a good person, you're a bad person. I mean, of course, in Christ, we're all bad people who can be saved and become forgiven people. That's what we want to focus on. So yeah, that's a challenge. It's a challenge to try and present yourself when talking to people that you're not going to be part of that. You're not looking to cancel somebody. You're looking to connect to them holistically as a human being who's going to have understandings coming from everywhere, and that's perfectly fine. Let's dialogue.
Thank you. As you know, Redeemer Downtown specifically is at least 40%, 45%, if not more, Asian American or Asian. So this person wants to engage on that and says, many of us come from Asian immigrant churches. For some, our parents and loved ones still belong to them where they can feel safe, welcome, and understood. These conversations feel disconnected from their day-to-day life. And for many of them, they have felt isolated and marginalized by both white and Black people. Disengagement feels like the path of least resistance. Is there a way to pull them into the conversation?
Well, first, let me say, having been an immigrant myself for a time, that in a way you're dealing with so much change and so much newness, and that you need an immigrant church. When we wrote the book about God's call for multiracial, multicultural churches, we give 3 exceptions, and one of them is the immigrant church, that when you're in first generation going into a new society, you need a time of transition. It might be your whole lifetime, and it's your children that move into the kind of space like a Redeemer. It might be, I mean, both of my grandparents on my mother's side were from Italy. They never learned to speak English well. So they pretty much just stayed in Italian Catholic Church as their way to make it in the society. So I get that. At the same time, as you transition into a new society, you know, especially once you become a citizen, then you're voting, you're paying taxes. So these conversations then all do matter. I think you probably always feel a bit like an outsider because you weren't here. It seems like this conversation's been going on forever. And it does get dominated by black and white. I know that. So other groups feel like, where do I fit? So no easy answer there. It's to have patience. And I would say as they have interest to invite them in, but to also give them permission to, it doesn't have to be their conversation. They're dealing with so many other things.
Yes. We have several questions coming in about the calls to unity that we're hearing. We often hear the term unity as a laudable goal. More often than not, though, unity simply looks like capitulating to the majority. What does Christ-centered unity actually look like for churches divided on issues of race?
Mm-hmm. Great question. They're all great questions, by the way. So unity does not mean absence of conflict. Unity means the ability to have conflict and keep working it out. I always say, and you've probably heard this before, but marriage is a great example. I've been married 35 years. I am unified with my wife. We disagree on many, many things, but we choose each other over our disagreements. That's what unity is to me, that we would choose each other as fellow Christians across race, even if we can never fully agree on things. And we never give up trying to work them out. That's the other issue. We don't give it up. We keep working.
Thank you. That's a very, very beautiful way to put it. This question, I think this question is trying to understand more of the toolkit and how it's influenced us. This person asks, has the biblical interpretation of free will shaped the thinking of white evangelicals, individual choices? Can you talk more about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so partly what I want to say is we get this mixture. We say in the book, it's like a smoothly blended soup of evangelical Christian understandings and enlightenment understandings of the world. Like one's a secular, one's Christian, but they get so merged at the founding of the country that it gets difficult to disentangle them, like why we have Christian nationalism. It's so difficult to figure out how to untangle them. So, okay, now I've forgotten the question. Remind me. I was getting there.
About how free will is there something about the way that we teach on white evangelical churches teach on free will that has influenced their decision making? Shaped the thinking. Has the biblical interpretation of free will shaped? How has the biblical interpretation of free will shaped the thinking of white evangelicals?
Profoundly. Like I said, that is not just in our understanding of our Christian faith, but in understanding social life. So when somebody, I mean, this is why we get this lazy butt account that I described. If someone is not succeeding economically, and we believe that we have freedom of opportunity, which some I didn't get into, but that's the fundamental starting point for people, white people at least, then if you're not succeeding, you're making bad choices. You have free will, you're free to succeed, and you have chosen not to. Just like you're free to be happy and you've chosen not to. So it gets applied in maybe ways it's not supposed to biblically, but it gets applied very broadly.
Thank you. And I really like this question. This person says, thank you for sharing the example from your own life about home ownership. What motivated you to make that financial decision? And do Christians have a calling to make these kinds of sacrifices?
Again, thank you for the question. So really short, about 25 years ago, God completely changed me. And I mean, it was like an Acts 2 kind of experience, and I won't go all into that. But one of the things that I directly heard from God Children were very young at that point. It was, you will live as the racial minority, you and your family, until I tell you otherwise. So in trying to that very specific call, that means we always have lived for the last quarter of a century in neighborhoods where we're the racial minority. And it also meant that's where we send our children to school, where we worship, all of that. So I would like to say, we as Christians have a biblical call, that we see injustice and we try to undo it. So if one structure is racial segregation, then we work to undo that. And in our own life, the easiest way is we move to a place where we're undoing the segregation. But I'm not naive enough to think there's going to be enough Christians to make that the answer. I mean, when I go and share that we lost serious amounts of money, that's not going to get too many people excited, I suppose. But I think as I heard you at the beginning, and Pastor White saying, compassion is joining in suffering. Compassion is joining in the reality of others. That's why I think God gave us that call, because that has meant our family has. And I have to say, the remarkable thing, my wife and I many a time wept as we watched our children in schools that we knew could be better, because we grew up in better schools, in neighborhoods that weren't always as safe as what we had grown up in, wondering what are we doing to our children. Our children are all to the person, all four of them say, thank you, thank you, thank you. There's no other way I'd want to grow up. And the ones that are now grown up, one is a pastor back in the very neighborhood he grew up in a multiracial church and working in the schools. And so God can do amazing things.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And as we are approaching 9 o'clock, just wanted to ask one last question. A question about our Christian witness. What encouragements do you have for churches that are like ourselves, who are seeking to learn more and to take action, and still struggle with how to move forward? What encouragements do you have for us as we are on this journey?
Well, I'm noticing, there's 100+ people who have stuck it out here. So that should be an encouragement that you have that much interest. So things like this are incredible tools to get started, to really focus on what are the issues. A next important stage is having those discussions with each other. What do we want to do? How do we? It's our own church's struggle. We want to be an alternative Chicago, we say, an alternate Chicago. How do we model we're called new community, a different kind of community? So we have to do it internally. So we have to work through our issues, and then we have to do it externally. So I'll just give you an example. So we do something called reconciliation weeks every, I'd say, semester. We do it in the fall, we do it in the spring. And it's weird in a way, because for a week, we break into our racially separate groups. It's like when you have men's Bible study and women's Bible study. We have white, Black, Asian, Hispanic, and we even have a multiracial group. And we talk with each other about where are we doing well, where are we not? And for the white group, we always have first gotten feedback from the communities of color in our church, where they say they think we're stuck, where we've improved, and where we're falling short. And then we talk about it. Why are we falling short? Where's it been going well? How's it been going in talking to our families? We work through that. And then, of course, we conclude by all coming back together, reuniting, recommitting to each other that we're going to keep pushing forward. Because we do have our disagreements. And I'll tell you, this summer, I don't know how it was for you all, this really stretched us. Even though we weren't meeting in person, what was going on this summer was so difficult. We really had to work hard to be together. Now, when we come together, we talk about how are we going to be that alternative community beyond our church walls. So we've always picked one other congregation that we raise funds for to give. That's one thing we do, but we also are involved in one long-term, usually racial justice project, whether that's working against a particular law that's harming people in our church or in our neighborhood. We pick one thing and work on it.
These are all beautiful ideas, things that I think our church should think about. Thank you so much for sharing that from your own church experience, and just for your encouragements, and again for being with us tonight, Michael, and to you and your colleagues for the decades of work and research, and just sharing all of your findings for all of these years, so that us and our communities can wrestle with the realities that are happening in our country and in our church, and giving us language with how to engage, so that we can move out into the world and play a role in racial reconciliation, in justice. And so we just thank you for being here tonight. Thank you everyone who sent in your questions. There was just so many amazing questions, and we recorded them all and we'll be sharing them with our staff team for us to reflect on and also consider. So thank you again for all for being here tonight. And I'm gonna ask Jeff White to close us for this evening and in prayer.
Again, Michael, thanks so much from our whole congregation. Grateful for you to be with us. Let's pray, friends. Oh Lord, as Michael just said, we do have our disagreements, and yet that never brings delight to us, Lord. We don't want to have those disagreements, but we see things differently, and we actually want to hear each other and wrestle in such a way that we do get to the place of having the mind of Christ. We take no joy in our disagreements, and yet we want to treat each other with humility and in good faith, so that, Lord, we can be a people who do live out that reality of longing to see your kingdom come on earth as it is and as it will be in heaven. So Lord, have mercy on us, work in each of our hearts the things that need to be worked in, so that we can increasingly become that kind of people, people of one heart and mind, who show forth the beauty of Jesus and his heart and mind in our world. We ask this for his sake. Amen. Thanks all. Thanks everyone for being with us. Michael, thanks again.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.